welcome everybody. The doors are shut, which means we can begin. So this is Death of the Other, How to Win the War for the Dawn. And so I am Jim. I'm commonly called Something Like a Lawyer, and I write for Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire.
And I'm Aziz from History of Westeros podcast. And this is going to be a fun topic. We love talking about the things coming up, the unknowns. And this is a kind of a unusual way to try to decide how we're going to deal with that. How we're going to deal with that, right? And I think you guys will enjoy the different ideas we have for how humanity might deal with armies of the dead and the others themselves. So let's do it.
Given that we all have warm blood and beating hearts, that puts us by default on the side of the light. At least, hey, if old man is true, they hate the smell of warm blood. So, and as far as we're concerned, I mean, she's a wise old storyteller, in the initial stages of a fantasy novel, which means she's pretty much gospel truth as far as everyone's concerned. But so the others at a first glance are almost invincible. I mean, they can feed on the actual dead of their enemies to raise them. So any casualties you incur will actually strengthen the others in straight 1-for-1. And the others themselves, they seem to be able to destroy terrestrial steel. They are supernaturally elegant. So really, there's it's a pretty tall order to go and fight them. But if there's one thing you need to know about the military, it's that the commanders don't get the top job by saying that they can't do something. So in the grand tradition of perhaps promising more than I can actually deliver, I'm going to tell you how to actually win the war for the Dawn.
Heck yeah. Now, a lot of this assumes that humanity isn't, totally ripping itself to shreds and actually has the means to do a lot of the things we're going to suggest today. But, and of course, there's always the possibility that George has some surprises for what the others can actually do. Maybe there's some unknown magic. But from what we know, we have a really good basis, at least, for what we think, at least some things that can make a big difference, that can save humanity, etc.
So the big thing is you need to be able to prepare your army to actually fight this. And you can actually see this as a theme that's running through the books where they say, the knowledge that we've lost, what we've forgotten, et cetera, et cetera. So that's actually a big theme because really these guys are so specialized that you actually need to be able to prepare appropriately. And best case scenario would be to actually prepare for a while in advance to be able to create stockpiles of specialized weaponry. When it comes to the others, you have basically two problems. You have the others themselves, then you have their army of zombies, which are basically whites. Although, unlike zombies, they showed actually a profound ability for intelligence. You see that with the whites that actually fight in the Wall in the very first novel. They know where exactly to go. They're actually attacking Jeor Mormont and what is his name, Jaffer Flowers?
Yeah,
I think his name
Jaffer, I don't know.
Yeah, they know they retain their knowledge exactly how much they can actually use of it. It depends on the actual knowledge they have, but they're not unthinking creatures. So you can't just, for example, create a big bonfire and then just wave a couple of living people in front and have them all walk to their deaths.
Right. It's important to remember that whatever the show gave us, there's some things that are probably going to be the same in the books, but there's definitely some significant differences, and it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to keep those things different, in your mind. But for example, like Jim said here in the show, we don't see the whites, except for in this exact same case, show much intelligence, but there is certainly evidence that they have at least some, or that they can be guided, more specifically. That controlled, not unlike you would imagine a skin changer controlling an animal. This is sort of the equivalent, skin changing the dead in a sense.
And we do know that the others themselves are intelligent, and not only they're intelligent, but as you see with the very first prologue chapter, they're actually also sadistic, so to the point that they have actually a very high functioning level of intelligence. So we're going to assume that the others are being led by an intelligent, capable leadership. We're not going to assume that they're going to be able to be baited in any silly ways. That if you're going to lure them into a feint, you're going to have to actually work to make it happen.
Right. They may not behave the way you would want them to behave. For example, in the show, they were just very much frontal assault, just kind of trying to overwhelm. That's not necessarily what will happen. We also saw in the show they were capable of waiting, and we might see more. I think we might see more of that in the books, where they take more advantage of their the cold and the darkness, and maybe things like starvation, which might actually force the humans to make the sally forth and attack to avoid dying without having used your swords.
But at the same time, if you have the time to prepare, then you can be able to stockpile your granaries. You can actually go and bake bread instead of just regular grain, which can rot. You can bake it into essentially crackers. It's twice baked bread, which is very resistant to rot and mold and things like that. They're called molar breakers or hardtack, based on the era you live in. But I mean, this was actually known even well into the time of the Crusades. So this ability to bake bread into basically rations that can last much longer will be important, given that Westeros itself has unusual seasons, especially in the north where a lot of this is going to happen. These techniques are probably already very well known within the actual among the actual people. I mean, you're probably going to have to slaughter a lot of the livestock. That's just how it is. Probably have to slaughter the horses before too long. Again, that's just how it is. You just can't keep them fed, can't keep them warm. And in this case, actually, humans are going to be more worthwhile than actual war horses, as we're going to explain.
Yeah.
Now, for the whites, the biggest vulnerability we see is fire. Now, that's very useful because actually thermal weaponry have a long and very illustrious history that I'm more than happy to talk about. So one of the key ways that you can deploy fire is with fire arrows. Now, think about everything you know in media depictions, and I'm going to tell you about 95 to 99% of that is wrong. Generally speaking, if you actually were to just tie a little cord with some flammable material like cotton or something like that on the back of an arrowhead, you dip it in a little oil, and then you light it on fire, and then you pull, and then you realize, oh no, I'm burning my hand and I need that. Because that's exactly, and then you fire it, assuming you can tolerate that, and then you watch as the fire gutters out about 20 feet after it actually leaves your bow, because the air is going past it so fast that it just snuffs it out. So actual fire arrows are much different. The conventional fire arrow in the olden times was a much larger, an oversized arrow with a very, very large head to break up the air and make it fly much slower. That way you can actually have a longer thing attached to it. It's far away from your arm. It will burn through the actual shaft if you let it, which is why it's more of a dump and release type arrow, which means the accuracy is very bad unless you're at incredibly short distances. When people realized that that was not good, what they did was they actually built a little lattice behind the arrowhead. Think of it kind of as a small four arrow thing. It was a little cage, essentially. You put a tiny little piece of coal that was lit down there. Now, as anybody knows who's ever actually grilled anything before, coals like air a lot more than actual just open flames do. You can actually be able to keep the arrow lit, and then once you hit, say, anything that is flammable, that coal has a chance to transfer that. Usually those types of arrows were used to actually light thatching on fire for houses, and that was meant to force people out of structures so that you could fight them out in the open.
Right on. Also particularly useful against ice biters, big as hounds.
Correct, especially because if you're worried about, say, for example, them climbing, because spiders are very, very good climbers, if you can fire down from the battlements and knock the spiders off, they can actually fall back into the cluster of whites.
Yeah, and the whites don't, have the same sense of self-preservation, so when one of them catches, they're still massed so close together.
Correct.
They would actually, the flame would actually spread better. So not only are they more flammable because they're desiccated, they don't have blood and humidity in their body, but they're so packed together, presumably,
and we also
it would spread really effectively.
But we actually do see in the first book when Jon is fighting the white, Othor, I think is his name, the Othor White.
Yeah.
It actually goes up very quickly. So you can actually see that bringing the fire to them is going to be much easier than setting just a regular conventional human being on fire. So if you're actually firing these arrows, you want to fire at the largest concentrations of whites you can. The snow bears that they have, these zombie polar bears, which are absolutely terrifying, are the number one target you actually want to be able to hit. The idea being that if that white goes up, it's going to raise the ambient temperature around them, hopefully enough to actually hit the flash point of the whites that are nearest to it. We all know convection is an actual thing, convection is an actual thing. So that's why you can't just walk up near fire or lava, because you'll set yourself on fire long before you actually even get close. It's the exact same concept here. If you can fire some fire arrows at the largest concentrations of whites, the largest whites you can, big formations of them, that is what you're going to be able to do to actually break up their formation and make them a lot more isolated.
There'd probably be some giants in there too. Those would be nice
that
targets.
would be even cooler.
Big stumbling, flaming, huge undead giant. Yeah, that sounds fun.
And the thing is, if you actually have that also happen, that's actually a big morale boost to your own troops to watch these zombies go up in flames. Man. Now, that is something we're actually going to get into because that's when we're going to talk about basic. How many MLB fans do we have in here? How many people do we like from Major League Baseball?
Just the two of us.
Oh, well, so pine tar is a big thing in Major League Baseball, but
gripping the bat.
You can actually pine tar is made by burning charcoal. To make charcoal, you basically burn it in a presence without oxygen. One of the byproducts of that is pine tar. Pine tar was used as caulk in the medieval world for boats and buckets and things like that. Now, you can thicken pine tar with animal fat. Sawdust is probably be more useful because you can actually eat animal fat. Hey, I mean, you're going to be in the winter. Cold is going to be a factor, which means you're going to be able to need to eat. Everything that is edible needs to stay edible. So sawdust would be much better. I mean, I know technically you can cut your bread with sawdust if you need to save money, but so usually you'd think so, but actually even in environments where the coldest that we've ever seen in the world, we've actually been able to continue to light fires even with primitive technologies. So, but the nice thing is if you thicken out this pine tar, you make what's called pitch. Pitch was used in the Middle Ages to actually waterproof roofs, these thatchings, to make sure water didn't get in. Pitch is flammable. Pitch is very flammable. Pitch is also very, very thick, which means that it burns very, very hot and it burns very, very long. That's the thing you really want to use when it comes to people that bring the cold, because if they bring the cold, you want to be able to have a long-lasting fire to do as much damage as possible with the smallest amount of resources you can.
Yeah, it's possible that they have some sort of magic that overcomes this, but it's, humanity's best chance, at least. Well, we would expect to see them try it, and hopefully it works. And if not, then, maybe they have to try something more dangerous like wildfire. But,
yep. Well, we'll talk about that as well. Yeah. So when you want to have this, you can actually use pitch with medieval siege weaponries. Now, usually when people are talking about siege weaponry, they think of a catapult. Now, a catapult, usually think it's a wooden frame, cantilever spring, bucket, arm, it goes like that. That's actually what the Romans called an onager. It was named after a donkey that was in the Persian areas. Today, you would call it Iran. And the reason why it was called that is because it kicked like a mule. And that's a fun little historical factoid I love to share with everybody. But you can actually put a bucket of pitch in that or a barrel of pitch in that, light it on fire, and send it out. If you have specialized siege engineer crews, which the Romans were able to do with their legionnaires, but, this is the Middle Ages. Training isn't quite at the level of the Roman times.
Not quite.
But even then, specialized siege engineers can actually do this. We see this actually in the books with Tyrion training his catapult crews at the Battle of the Blackwater. He says, everybody that spatters will be replaced. And he was able to very quickly train up crews that were able to use this wildfire, which is much less safe than just regular burning pitch. So if you're able to do that, you get in a fortification, you put this onager or a counterweight trebuchet. The counterweight trebuchet is what you see. It's that thing with the big long sling at the end. It drops that box of lead and rocks, and it just does that. That's actually has even further range. So if you know that the armies are coming, you set up your staggered things. You set up your trebuchets first, then your onagers. Then you can actually go for your smaller hand weapons because of much less range. The goal, obviously, being to kill as many of them from as far away as possible. But when you get at extreme distances, accuracy is always sometimes a factor. So you just have to make do with what you can do. But even then, counterweight trebuchets were actually incredibly accurate. And they are in the novel series. We actually do see those. Blue shirt.
Just a follow-up question. So is that the mechanism for delivering the pitch or, the trebuchets or oil? Like they use boiling oil already, but it looks like only when they're
So usually,
coming upstairs or downstairs from ladders, but
yeah, or in through murder holes and things like that. Interestingly enough, it's actually usually smoking oil as opposed to boiling oil. Boiling oil actually takes a lot of energy, so usually smoking oil is just enough. And that was actually rare because olive oil was so expensive. Typically, they actually use just boiling water, or even what they would do is get dirt and heat it up, and just because you could actually see. I mean, you see these helmets with the breathing holes. Hot dirt gets in there. It gets into your face. It gets into your throat and sears people. But the thing is, if all of these things can raise the ambient temperature enough to hit the flash point, and that's the magic. That's all you need to do is to get it hot enough that these guys start spontaneously combusting. And like we see in the first novel, they do this. The lights go up very, very quickly. Now, wildfire is dangerous. So wildfire is kind of the Martin's equivalent of Greek fire mixed with a little bit of nitroglycerin. Like Greek fire, wildfire does not extinguish when it's exposed to water. The formula for Greek fire has been lost to history, unfortunately, but it's theorized that it's thickened petroleum with resin and some other stuff. There are naturally occurring petroleum wells in and around the Black Sea, which is where the Byzantines were able to get it. So that's where it gets the Greek fire. Nitroglycerin is a explosive compound that is very, very shock sensitive. We hear about wildfire that when it gets older, it gets more, quote, fickle, to the point where even direct sunlight can set it off. Whereas in nitroglycerin is very, very shock stable, pretty much in any temperature higher than 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Alfred Nobel was able to actually make it much more transportable, but with dynamite by actually soaking it in diatomite and soda ash. And later on, we just used sawdust and soda ash because it was much cheaper to get. But even so, I mean, basically, dynamite is nitroglycerin soaked in sawdust with soda ash to stable it, and then you just wrap it in a wrapper. The problem is that nitroglycerin degrades over time into less stable forms. And that would soak through the wrapper, and then it would become shock sensitive. This was called weepy dynamite or sweaty dynamite because it actually looked like it was getting moist. And that caused the deaths of many combat engineers, especially in World War II, when you would go on these unstable roads, it would hit a bump, and then the entire truck would go up in flames because one thing of dynamite goes off, it hits off all the other dynamite that's in the box, and so on and so forth. And of course, because everybody knew how unsafe it was, they would try to use the new dynamite as it came in, which meant the old dynamite would get older and less safe, and so on, until essentially it's basically the worst game of hot potato you can ever think of. I know it's horrible. It's just how it was back then.
Should we talk about some up-close fighting?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Some up-close fighting is good. If one of the best things you can actually do if you have some time to prepare is just a simple trench. Now, trenches are simple. They're just basically ditches, and you dig them deep enough, and it's supposed to arrest forward movement for both infantry and cavalry. And if you can dig it deep enough and then line it, usually we would line it with stakes when we're fighting conventional forces. That's less useful because technically it's possible for the white to just step through a stake and then just kind of continue on forward, even if it has to drag its foot along, whereas that wound would be completely incapacitating to a rational human being that feels pain and fear and all of that good human emotion.
That's kind of at the core of what's so different about fighting the undead is they don't react the same to wounds and stimulus in general, and that in effect actually has a reverse morale effect where you have soldiers fighting something and hitting them in spots that they would expect to deal a killing blow and it not working. You have all these years of, in some cases, you don't have years of training. Peasants are not going to have a lot of training, but knights are taught to strike in certain areas. They know where vital organs are. They know, the best ways to strike an opponent. But these things are just not as effective against a white, especially big slash down the chest would just do nothing.
Head wounds don't actually work and stuff like that. Whereas if you hit somebody in the head with a mace, it didn't matter how heavy their helmet was, how good their armor was, their day was over. Whereas that just won't work. I mean, you can crush a head for a white, and the rest of the body is still going to come at you.
Yeah,
So
so you really have to do more disabling type strikes, or the trenches are particularly effective in that way because they're coming up. They don't have you have a temporary height advantage, and there's also it's possible that going for the legs is more effective, or going for the feet, because even if they're disabled, on the ground, they can still get at you, but they can't really go for any vital organs on a human if all they can reach is your
and that
knees.
depends on the kit of you as well. If you have a full metal kit and the white is unarmored, they're not going to get you unless they can knock you over. Now the problem is that they could try to knock you over because they don't feel pain and they don't feel fear. But if you're able to do that, for example, you get a trench, you shove all your shields down, do the old school Anglo-Saxon shield wall. But I mean, I say that like it was especially the Anglo-Saxons. Nearly everybody had done it at one point or another to be able to create a barrier. Then you can get pole arms and spears out over there to try and hit them. And that really is how you can be able to do that. If you get them down from a trench, they won't be able to get up. Think of it like just basically crab pots. They're trying to climb over each other in order to actually do that, interfering with that as much as you can. You really want to be able to fight these guys from fortification. But if you can't, and you've got a couple of guys with spades and other digging tools, you won't be too badly if you're able to establish yourself with a solid fighting trench to help build you an ad hoc fortification. Or if you're fighting from a ruin, you can supplement your fortifications you have with trenches. That would be like if, for example, I would actually tell Jeor Mormont to run, actually, because of the Fist of the First Men. But if you had to fight at the Fist of the First Men, get some shovels out there because you're really going to need it.
I think we had a couple questions over here.
I was just wondering, so in that sense, would putting the burning dirt on them really do much, since they can't, they're not going to be bothered if they're held?
Depends on how hot you can heat it. It's all about hitting the flash point for them. Now, I would recommend actually not using the burning dirt because it's not as flammable as something, and not only do you want them to burn, but you want them to stay burning long enough to set other whites on fire. So that's why flammables such as pitch, oil would be more effective. The problem again with oil is that you also can eat oil. So oil does provide valuable calories and fats. So,
and you pointed out boiling water. That probably wouldn't be very effective against whites either.
Boiling water is only at 200 degrees, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not very much.
Probably would just ignore it entirely.
I mean, regular fires burn it much hotter than that.
Yeah.
So
that's another example of like a small adaptation that this just wouldn't be a normal weapon against humans. That's just not going to work here.
But you can still use this smoking oil from the murder hole which they would typically use for dropping boiling water. You can use it to do this smoking oil, or I mean, heck, even if you just jump a bunch of just hot oil and then drop a couple torches down, that'll help. I mean, in improvised, even merchant ships used cranes. They would just drop bales of burning hay on enemy ships to try and light them on fire and set fires to their crew. You can do the same thing if you're at a port or something like that. Drop bales of burning hay on whites. Why not? I mean, if you've already slaughtered the animals, it's not like you're going to be able to eat it. So you might as well use it as a weapon.
So speaking of slaughtering horses and maybe not being able to use them as effectively, or needing to have certain considerations because of the effort it keeps to upkeep them, assuming we do have a situation where horses are able to be deployed against an army of the dead, say Dothraki or knights or both, what do we think would be some tactics effective against them? Because obviously you can't hide behind trenches and fortifications. So we've talked a little bit about attacking a fixed position, the armies of the dead, but there may also be some clashes out in open spaces. And that's a particularly different case because you don't necessarily have time for trenches or a lot of these other things that we were talking about involve preparation. And there's definitely going to be a lot of battles. It's not just going to be one large battle like the show had. There'll be lots of battles, almost certainly. And that's going to mean a lot of different types of battles. They're not just all going to be castles. There'll be cities that get attacked as well. Not that there's a lot of cities in Westeros, but I suppose White Harbor is in particularly big danger. And you can't defend a city the way you can a castle. And of course, besieging a city, if possible, can be a lot more effective because there's a lot more mouths to feed. You can't you can't send the women and children elsewhere. Well,
maybe
you might be able to.
I think King's Landing, you could probably send them to Essos. You could send all of the non-combatants to Essos.
You might be able to do that, yeah.
But
absolutely.
even so, I mean, there's things in the water. That's what Cotter Pike says. So, I mean, just if
What
you could
does
see
that mean?
If you could see a pod of zombie orcas attacking ships, that would be crazy.
Wow.
Hey, trust me, I think about this stuff all the time. I'm a fantasy writer myself. So I think about crazy crap like this all the time. Find me if you ever want me to talk your ears off about crazy stuff I've thought of.
Cavalry
so
and
scouting is actually one of the best things that cavalry can do, especially like cavalry, like the Dothraki. Now, if we're fighting others, the Dothraki and their horse archery, load those guys up with some obsidian dragonglass arrowheads. That could be some real danger, especially if you can see, for example, the others leading a small band of whites being able to just kind of go up, attack really fast, kill the other, and then retreat, because the Dothraki do understand how to do feigned retreats, and they're going to outpace most whites that are just basically at the speed of an ambulatory human being.
Yeah.
That is actually a very effective way. We don't know exactly how the others will react to the loss of their own during an actual full-on war situation. Obviously, we had Sam the Slayer, but that was more of an isolated other with isolated circumstances. As other casualties start to pile up, we know they're intelligent. They're going to react to this. So being able to hit the whites with morale is a worthless cause. The others might be an entirely different ballgame. I mean, of course, they could just be supernaturally, omnicidal to the point where they say it doesn't matter how many losses we're going to take, we're going to destroy all warm life, or we're going to be obliterated ourselves.
Yeah.
That's entirely possible, but we don't know, and there's no harm in trying.
So another thing to clarify that's kind of important, I suppose, the way the Dothraki are depicted on this show, they're more of a head-on assault type force. They don't do a lot of the archery. There's a few guys firing
which is weird.
bows.
They're heavy cavalry without heavy armor, which is very bizarre.
So you should expect to see in the book versions. We should expect to see a lot more of them shooting arrows.
Yeah.
It's not like some of them are archers. It's all of them are archers.
But if you're fighting to get
really
back to
amazing.
your original question, because if there's one thing I'm good at, it's distracting myself. If you're going to fight with cavalry, have the infantry pin them first and then hit them on the flanks. That way you can actually be able to push through. Even though these guys don't feel pain, the mass and momentum is still effective. So do the hammer and anvil technique that Baelor and Maekar made so famous at the Redgrass Field. I mean, this is actually what a use of infantry and cavalry together. That is the best thing you can do, is pin them with your infantry and then have your mobile element sweep in from the back or the front or the side. That was one of the reasons why, if you ever see any hypothetical matchups between the Roman army and just a medieval Western European army, the Western Europeans will win because their infantry will pin them, and then the legionnaires will get taken in the back by the cavalry. Cavalry was always a big weakness of Rome, and the Western Europeans were very, very good at getting their heavy cavalry, especially later into the Middle Ages.
So what would the plan B be in this case if you can't pin them, for example, say because there's just too many of them? Like if it's an overwhelming size, what would the proper strategy for cavalry be in that spot?
I wouldn't engage an overwhelming mass of army, because if you're engaging them in the open, they can actually bring their numbers to bear. They'd be able to actually sweep around you and then start hemming you in. I do not want to engage a large infantry white army. I would look for more advantageous terrain, something like Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. You can be able to do that. I mean, I know 300 is about as ahistorical as you could possibly be without actually just making up completely new stuff, which, I mean, they did. But the concept of being able to use a smaller force to hold back a larger force by taking advantage of secured flanks and impassable terrain is very good. So I would actually have your cavalry scout out good places to fight and then transport using essentially mounted the dragoon system. For example, you had a cavalry, then an infantry soldier would ride on back, transport the engineers, dig, and then get going that way.
I wonder how many spots like that are available. I mean, there might be some in the West. Maybe the neck. The neck might be an interesting place for a battle. I wonder how whites behave in swamps.
It depends on whether or not the rivers freeze.
Yeah.
Fast-moving river is going to pull. I mean, a fast-moving river will pull anything away.
Yeah.
If it's deep enough.
As you said, the how the others react to the loss of their own is a kind of an unknown, but so
open
is
question right now.
So is how they deal with a lot of these things, right? Like it seems entirely possible that you're right that they can just
cold, though, so they might
freeze.
the
Yeah,
rivers,
they could freeze the swamps or the rivers.
Salt or fresh water. Salt water is a little bit harder, but fresh water could easily freeze if the others do indeed bring the cold. And we know from what what Tormund was telling us, the fires are a little bit dimmer. They're a little bit colder. You have to get in a little bit closer.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that they can at least have some supernatural effect over the weather. How much is an open question.
Yeah, we certainly believe they'll be able to do things like generate mist, and
Yes.
that could make scouting more difficult. It could at least, hey, there's a strange mist over there. I guess the others are somewhere in the vicinity, but that. For all we know, they could make really large amounts of this.
They probably do what's called ice fogs, which, if nobody's ever been to northern Alaska, are basically when the moisture in the air itself starts to freeze. They are incredibly beautiful, but when that happens, it means it's about, I think, at least 20 or 30 below. So it's also very dangerous when that happens, because then that fog will permeate your skin or, the things you're wearing. So any exposed skin will start leaching heat when that happens. It's, like I said, very beautiful if you ever get the chance, but at least know what you're getting into if you ever actually go up that far.
Okay, so another big question that is certainly going to come up, and this is maybe it's definitely where we lack real world knowledge, just like the others are a bit of a wild card in how exactly they deploy their armies, their tactics, and what magical abilities they have that can be used in large scale battles. What are the dragons going to be used? How would we deploy dragons against the others, assuming that they can fly? There's two different scenarios, I think, that are entirely possible here. That it's possible that the others, using winds and storms, make it difficult for dragons to fly in a battle. But let's assume that is or isn't possible, and also how effective they would be on the ground if they couldn't fly. Mm-hmm. And finally, just in general, how we would want to use them.
So one thing that is important is that we do know that heavy winds and storms can ground dragons. We saw this at the last storm with Queen Rhaenys, the sister wife of Aegon the Conqueror. So if they can fly, you want to use them for both direct attack and area denial. If you can put a line of flame. Basically, the nice thing about dragons is it's all of the fire attack with none of the boring prep work of actually having to move combustibles, which is actually very difficult, especially in a pre-modern time when you don't actually have incendiary weapons. So if you can be able to just set fires in front of the whites, it could stop their movement. If you don't see any of them with very many, let's just say, ranged weapons, to the point of even rocks and sticks, anything that can be used to knock them. Now, usually won't be able to knock somebody off because they are chained into the saddle. But, if you take a head injury or something like that, it's still bad news. That's how a Persian general at Marathon died that way. He had his head caved in with a rock thrown at him, not actually in the actual battle with, I believe it was the Spartans or the Athenians, which is always kind of interesting. But so you can burn these whites. You can have a long stream of fire, that will very much get a cascade fire scenario where these whites start setting fire to other whites because there's a long, heavily burning fire. And then these whites themselves catch on fire, continuing that raising the temperature to the flashpoint.
Yeah. And this is where I start to wonder how the others adapt. We know we've, established at the beginning here that they're intelligent, and if they're not likely to continue to make the same mistake. If they have dragons are used particularly effectively against them, they're probably going to change their tactics. They might be able to spread their armies out, just move around positions that have been set up, not, like you said, not be baited into fighting on battles that they don't, that are disadvantageous terrain-wise.
Or trying to attack when the dragons are resting.
Right, which is why I mentioned at the beginning why siege is particularly important and possible for the others to employ. Starvation and maybe their ability to bring cold could actually cause severe damage to people all holed up in there. And that adds a third factor, which is, Jim talked a lot about how they could avoid issues with starvation And the cold is kind of a wild card, but disease is another one that's pretty important here. And I'm not even talking about grayscale specifically, though grayscale is certainly a part of this, meaning magical diseases that we can't entirely understand. But basically, just think about it this way. You've got people in a medieval setting that don't understand infections and the spread of infections. And you don't have enough food, probably eating less than the amount you would need. You don't have enough calories for your body to stay warm fully. And the lack of warmth is going to make you more susceptible to infection. People are going to be sharing blankets and spaces like that, and George is very aware of this.
Any open wound will be able to get a vector very easily, and you have to. Unfortunately, you would have to burn the corpses. Corpses have been one of the greatest vectors of disease since ancient times. I mean, early biological warfare was pretty much do this with this corpse, throw it into a well, catapult it over the walls.
Which we see in Marine.
Well, interestingly enough, I'm actually interested to see if they could actually catapult whites. If others could ever use siege engines. Now,
Whoa.
I do think, however, there is a defense against that if you're in a place that was built by Brandon the Builder. While we don't know for certain, I'm pretty sure
that's why the wall's so tall.
The architectural magics that Brandon the Builder might have. I mean, you would just be basically catapulting corpses in at that point because. I mean, we do see that the others have to be brought across the wall.
Yeah.
So you can, I mean, again, this is more speculative than I'd like to be, but I do think that Brandon the Builder knew enough that he was able to kind of build things. So if you have to pick Winterfell, Storm's End, those are the places you really want to be at. Storm's End would actually be great if they don't have anything in the other, because then you could, use the Davos path to get supplies in and out.
Yeah.
Especially if Essos doesn't have it, Western Essos doesn't have the problem. Then you could actually, especially if you're in King's Landing or anything like that, setting up regular supply lines with Pentos, the Triarchy, Bravos especially because they have a lot of ships. So a shipment tends to, if this pod of zombie orcas does sink ships, somebody could be able to get through. If you have a convoy and some wildfire would be good there too, because wildfire burns on the water.
Yeah, keep them from crossing that way. Yeah, I wonder too about places like Bravo. Like Bravo, the southern free cities are another matter, but Bravos is pretty far north. That once the veil is struck by winter, I would think that Bravos would be along the same line. Imagine the canals of Bravos freezing. And then that would be something, huh?
Yeah, the flooded part of the city, and then whites just walking on top of it.
Just walking right over it, yeah.
And then. No, it is salty, but the thing is, we depending on how cold it can get, though. I mean, salt water freezes at about, I think, 5 below, I think is where it freezes. So that might happen. Now, I know we've got 10 minutes left, and we haven't even talked about Dragonglass yet, so we need to get into that.
Yeah, let's do that.
Now, so Dragonglass is essentially obsidian. Obsidian is a volcanic glass, but there is magic involved in it, so don't think you can just throw pumice stones at the others and have them explode. I mean, you can try it if you want, but I mean that's on you. So obsidian is humanity's been using it basically since the Neolithic for sharp things, scarification implements, religious implements, tools, small weapons. The problem is, as a glass, it's very, very brittle. So you can't make a large blade with it. So what the Aztecs did, because of they didn't have very much metal in the Mesoamerican region, so they became really good. They used Aztecs pretty much up until European contact. They used what's called a macuajito. It looks like a big oar, and then it's got obsidian shards on the end of it. It looks like a saw. You can actually fight with it. Now the nice thing is that since obsidian is brittle, but you have so many shards, if one breaks, so what? You still got more. You can actually replace and remove them very easily, especially if you're doing one of their flower wars, which flower wars were meant you would actually capture live prisoners, so they would remove them so that you were actually hitting them more with like a wooden thing so you could beat them over the head.
And then sacrifice them. Yeah.
Yes, and then sacrifice them to usually Huey Titzelpotle, the sun god.
Friendly guy.
Aztec... talk to me about Aztec mythology. I know way too much about it. It's fascinating, actually.
Yeah, supposedly those swords. There's an account from the conquest of Mexico, where a horse's head was completely severed with a kind of Gregor Clegane style with one of these.
No, that was
obsidian
because
blades.
They had two-handed ones that were man-sized. That was what they were using. So
big ass thing.
Basically, you could use it until the battle, and then when you go back to camp, you could go and put more shards in if you needed to. So that, little Aztec ingenuity might actually be something. If you've got an other hunting, other killing squad, The other thing that you could use is arrowheads. Obsidian can actually be used to make arrowheads. The children of the forest use them.
And the fact that the children of the forest left so many in the cache is very interesting. You know, like you said, Bran.
That was Benjen that made that.
It's possible, but if it was given to him by someone or the children or something,
it's possible. Yeah.
Of course, like you said, because Brandon the Builder would have some ideas to how to fight the others in the dead, because supposedly they did beat them in the battle for the Dawn, so they would have, hey, this is what worked. But yeah, so by the same vein, you would expect to see some of that memory from the children hopefully passed down.
But at the same time, you can't just use obsidian. You can't just have some obsidian arrows and say, "Here you go, problem solved." You actually, we want to make sure that we're actually taking these guys out. So I would actually train my other killing squads in volley fire tactics. Volley fire is basically everyone fires at the same time. That means so everyone, you say knock, draw, loose. And the reason why we do that is we see in the very beginning that the others are supernaturally elegant. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but maybe they could dodge an arrow. All this,
knock it out of the sky with their sword.
Neo Matrix style.
Yeah.
But it would be much harder to do with a lot of them being fired at once. You also want to be able to fire in enfilade. Now, firing in enfilade means firing on the flank. You fire from usually at 90 degrees or something like that, where you're actually being able to fire from more than one angle. You can have two squads at 90-degree angles firing all at once. That's probably one dead other right there, or however many that they have. And being able to do that means actually being able to minimize their ability to project, because we don't know exactly how the whites do, but we know that the others are going to be the thinking part of their army. If we can cripple the thinking part of their army, then we're actually only left with they're intelligent, but not as intelligent. And that's when you can start doing, maybe even getting brave enough to actually start deploying fire squads.
Yeah.
Or, taking out a dragon to being able to scout, then sending out a fire squad. I mean, dragons' reconnaissance is one of the most effective things, because there's no territorial barrier that can stop a dragon in flight. I mean, it makes them the best reconnaissance, because not only are you able to go anywhere you want, you can see so much farther because you don't have to worry about trees or rocks or cliffs or anything that's blocking you.
Yeah, so I wonder if and how the others will deploy on a large scale. Certainly, we've talked about battles, pretty large-scale battles, but if we go look at things at a campaign level, you wonder how they will adapt to what the humans were doing. Again, we talked about this with fighting back against dragons, but they may split their forces in particularly interesting ways. They may decide that smaller-scale engagements make more sense based on how the humans are adapting, and which is what we see in the Dance of the Dragons. You don't want to have these large armies when dragons are around, because dragons can be so effective against a bunch of people packed together. You started in the Dance of the Dragons, you saw lots of smaller engagements, a few thousand versus a few thousand, rather than these larger armies clashing. So you really wonder, there's a lot of possibilities for George to play with how he can have the others adapt their own campaign strategies. And for example, just by having smaller groups of whites, or others, they can have the opportunity to defeat a group and become a large group. You can go from a small group to a large group, and it doesn't have to be this one gigantic, massive army that is all together.
Especially
at
if they're
all
going
times.
to hit smaller villages, hamlets, and that sort of thing. But then we can't go too far in that, because we don't want to speculate too much into the actual intelligence of the others. Again, they might be so omnicidal that they have to do this, just in terms of a metaphysical perspective. I mean, we know they're probably at least somewhat tied to the metaphysics of the unequal or the uneven settings or seasons. I'm sorry. Right. So we don't want to go too far into speculating about that, just because there's so much we don't know. Just from the fact that the others look human, they're not. They're the unseelie fae, and the idea of xenopsychology. I don't know how many science fictions we have here. Xenopsychology is the thoughts and thinking thoughts of processes that are not human. They are distinctly alien.
Yeah, it's like
we can't
paradigm shift styles of thinking.
So we don't know exactly what that is, but if they are intelligent, then we have to. I think actually that's the best use we can for the dragons, is being able to know where they're moving. If you fly high enough, there's nothing that they can do. It's basically like flying the U-2 back in the early Cold War. There's just nothing can engage that high.
And you wonder too about how much, say, this was not. I hesitate to say underutilized in the show. It was almost not utilized at all. But one time, at least, we saw Bran using ravens to scout the army of the dead.
Oh, they needed to do that. bird skin changers need to do it. Basically, until the actual the weather would get too bad that they freeze to death. You have to be able. You could send that, and that would be much easier, especially depending on how many skin changers you have, because you can also keep them in an isolated place, and then pretty much all you have to do is not worry about Melisandre and her fireballs.
Which is, by the way, a whole other topic which we couldn't really get into because it's pure speculation, but it's worth mentioning because it's definitely going to be a thing, which is that Daenerys will almost certainly bring more than just Melisandre to Westeros with her in terms of her army. Besides, not talking about the Unsullied and the Dothraki, of course they count too, but I'm talking about
R'hllorite fire magic.
We got Makoro giving Victarion a firearm. I mean, we're just scratching the surface, I think, of what some of these high priests of R'hllor can do.
And they do have a dualistic. They have a dualistic religion of an enemy god that is the servant of death and cold, which sounds a whole lot like the others. I'm not saying that the others, the R'hllor magic and the Great Other are related, but I am saying there's enough of a metaphysical resonance, I would think, that you get a lot of R'hllorites saying, sign me up. Let's go and bring some fire magic up in.
Yeah, and it's really amazing, too. It's a slightly off topic, but just how much of a parallel there is there. The others have armies of the dead, which are in a sense immortal, and that's what Benero is promising followers, who is the high priest of the Red Temple at Volantis, which is the largest one in the world that we know of. And he says that anyone who follows Daenerys will have eternal life, and there will be eternal summer. That doesn't sound so great, actually, but it's kind of an interesting thematic dichotomy or parallel to what the others are doing. So so the R'hllorists versus the others is a big, huge, big question mark, but it's certainly going to be a thing. It's just hard to
certainly if George is looking to bring more fantasy magic into his setting, especially if there's blood sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that's something that'd be very interesting, especially if you look at the supernatural apocalypse, and then is it okay to sacrifice someone to stop the supernatural apocalypse, which is going to be the Stannis. Spoiler alert, that's going to be the Stannis arc in Book 6. I mean, we don't know that, but
it seems it seems like
we know it.
Please don't burn her.
We were given our 5-minute mark, so let's open it up to if anybody's got anything.
I just want to say as well. Oh, go ahead. Well, I'll have a good. Let me say this real quick, and then we'll take your question. It's just as a sort of topic wrap up, in a sense, statement here. We've done a little speculation. Some of this is more straightforward in terms of things that they're clearly going to have to do, or at least something along those lines. There's a lot of other possibilities. Like we said, there's a lot of unknowns. And that just gives you, to me, that just fills me with excitement, because there's just so many possibilities for how these wars can go, how these fights can go. It's going to be really interesting. And that was, I think, part of the disappointment with the show is how little they delved into that. They kind of just resolved it really quickly and didn't really get into all these tactics and all these possibilities and all these interesting strategies that could go back and forth. Like when Tyrion is thinking about how to use the wildfire and the chain, his thought process is about how this is going to work and then actually seeing it in effect. That was just really satisfying. And I hope we get stuff like that for the armies of the dead right here.
I guess the big question is, how do each of y'all think they get through the wall?
Okay. The question is, how do we think they get through the wall? I still think the horn is not unlikely, either because it's been foreshadowed to be important. If we go by, obviously there's no Night King in the books, or probably not, but it's certainly possible that we have an undead dragon. Euron's horn could work as well, and he could decide he wants to take the wall down because he's Euron, and you never know with that guy.
Well, I mean, he's clearly looking for divine apotheosis, so it is entirely possible that the fear of the wall coming down, that coming in, is what he's trying to use to help metaphysically jump that, along with the blood magic ritual that he's doing in the sea that we see foreshadowed in the Forsaken chapter.
He's got plans.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, the problem is that he's actually going to get womp womp, and he's going to get overshadowed by the actual others, because pretenders get killed when the actual big bad comes calling.
You got blue lips, we got blue everything.
Yes, I like that.
Right here.
Okay, two things, because you touched on stance of sacrifice. Talking about Cherie.
Yes.
Yeah.
He won't be affiliated with that. He's quite far from it.
I think when the wall is going to come down and the refugees from the wall are going to come in, and one of the few groups that are going to get there, probably through Relorite magic, is going to be Melisandre, Bing, Solis, and Shireen and Tug.
I would expect Stannis to win, to actually take Winterfell, and then to be besieged there, and to burn Shireen as a last resort because they're surrounded and starving and dying. Kind of like he was at Storm's End, right? Like it's that was kind of a parallel to what he's going to face later, I think.
It won't be to bring John back.
No.
Probably not. No, maybe it's possible, but I don't think
it's going
so.
to be a Relorite magic thing to actually wake dragons from stone, so that they could actually use the fire against the others and the whites. That's what I think personally. But I mean, if it's maybe that whole theorized dragon clutch of dragon eggs under Winterfell, that might come into play. They might say, hey, look, here's some eggs. Yeah. If you burn, that which is most precious, you might be able to. I mean, and again, the question is, if you're facing apocalypse, that's a metaphysical question that I don't even want to touch, just in terms of metaphysics and ethics.
Yeah, on the high view, for very high view, it's extremely unethical, but in it's just
part
an unrealistic situation.
Part of the reason why it is unethical is because it doesn't work in
it could never work in the real world.
It doesn't work.
But it might work in the Song
Looks
of
like we've been
Fire.
given the red card, so thank you very much for coming. I actually have the next hour free, so I'm more than happy to talk to Annie and all of you.
Cool. Thanks, y'all.